The topic we chose tonight, this morning, is to look at the issue of really what we're talking about is bias and political correctness. And in news reporting, just to set this discussion up a little bit, I'm just going to make a few brief remarks, and then the panelists will address these issues as well. And what I hope is that we can get a discussion going so that we'll hit the highlights, and then if you want us to go into it in more detail, please. We're going to leave a good period of time for questions, for things like WikiLeaks, which is certainly in the news right now. First, the role of a free press is obvious. It's that we really do provide a check on government. We're not, we're described as the fourth estate, but in reality, we don't have the same kind of power. We don't have legislative, judicial, or executive, or military power. What we do have is the power to shine light on things, to reveal things and expose things. And so that, the main mission, and I didn't, when I started out in this, and I've been doing this for over about 30 years, give or take a couple, and I really found that the news media is really vital to U.S. national security. So many times I've encountered situations where people have come to me with information. They said they've been to their bosses within government, they've been to the Congress, they've sought legal action through the courts, and the last resort usually is they come to reporters. So they provide this independent check, and it's really, again, I didn't believe this when I started, but I certainly over the years came to appreciate it more. But the main thing I would point out is that, especially in news reporting, what we do is more of a reflection of our sources. We have a saying that you're only as good as your sources. If you have good sources, and I've had some really incredible sources over the years, you tend to get a lot of good reporting. If you have bad sources, you get bad reporting. And if you have politically biased, you get politically biased reporting. Now, the problem is that what has come to be termed the mainstream media, in my view, has relied on kind of an institutional, it's been termed the mainstream media, a kind of elitist, academic. It's all a very close-knit club, and that has kind of tended to create these problems, especially as it relates to national security journalism. A good example of this was a recent story in another Washington newspaper, not my own and not Sara's, and this was a story about China. And the sources quoted in the story were Ken Lieberthal, who was a Clinton administration official on the National Security Council in charge of Asian affairs, who after he left government went to work for a business that does business in China. And if you do business in China, that puts you in a different category because the Chinese are very strong in influencing people. If you say anything bad about China, you're not going to do business in China. So that was one of the sources. And then the rest of the sources were official Chinese sources, including somebody from an institute called the China Institute for Contemporary International Relations. It's known as KICKR, but it also happens to be a front organization for the Ministry of State Security. So I just sent an email to the reporter and I said, hey, these sources are kind of suspect. Couldn't you, here's what you're reporting on. And the reporter was very defensive. I wasn't really out to write about it. I was just questioning him on it. And he said, well, I did have someone quoted from the Heritage Foundation, but an editor took it out. So here you had and this kind of exemplifies the problem a little bit. Is there a bias, an anti-military bias? The coverage generally of the military is okay, but there have been some fairly egregious examples, and I want to highlight just three that make the case. And this has to do with the Pulitzer Prize, which is the print journalism's highest award. If you look over the past 10 years at 3 of the awards given by the Pulitzer Committee, it makes a case that really raises serious questions about the issue of anti-military bias. The first was in 2000. The Pulitzer Committee awarded a Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting to the Associated Press for a story about No-Gun-Ri in Korea. And this was an alleged massacre that occurred, and if you look up the statistics, that says that between 800 and 400 people were massacred in this report. That's a pretty big margin of error. And what happened was they won the award, and then sometime after that, U.S. News and World Report did some digging about that story and found that one of the sources for the AP was someone who had fabricated the entire testimony that was used in the story. He wasn't at the site. This again happened 50 years ago, or more than 50 years ago. In any case, it raised questions about why, something that happened, it was taken out of context. The North Koreans were using civilians as they advanced in front of them. The military was concerned that again, they were using them as human shields, and then you had this thing, but that wasn't the context. Then in 2004, the Pulitzer Committee again gave an award to the Toledo Blade for a story about a military atrocity in Vietnam. And the message was unmistakable to young journalists and others: if you want to win an award, write a story about a military atrocity. Now, I'm not saying it's not a good thing to go after and expose things. That's really the role of the press, has to do that. But here you have a situation where there were some questionable grounds. The last Pulitzer related to military and defense issues was in 2009. The New York Times was awarded a Pulitzer for investigative reporting about the Pentagon's practice of using retired generals and defense officials to promote its policies. There was a lot of implication in the stories that won the award that this was somehow a violation of a conflict of interest, that somehow, because these retired officials were now contractors, that this was somehow part of a corrupt system of basically being in bed with the Pentagon to promote its policies and in exchange getting contracts. Well, there was one problem. 2 investigations, one by the GAO, of the Congress's audit arm, and the Pentagon's own Inspector General found out that there was nothing wrong. They both came to the conclusion that nothing was wrong. So that's a third example of the issue. Quickly on the issue of political correctness, I think that the issue of missile defense is clearly a case where political correctness, as reflected in the biases of arms control advocates, was an issue which really affected our national security. And I had a front row seat for this during the 90s. This was when the military, which had taken casualties during the first Gulf War, the single largest number of casualties in the Persian Gulf War was from a Scud missile that hit a barracks in Dhahran. And the Pentagon said, we need missile defenses. We need to be able to defend against this. But at the time, the arms control community was going in the opposite direction. They had adopted the view that the 1972 anti-ballistic missile treaty with the then Soviet Union was the centerpiece of our national security. In other words, they believed that by keeping this treaty, it would keep down the number of strategic offensive missiles. It really didn't. But in any case, there was a battle over expanding that treaty, which was to cover long-range missiles, to actually ban defenses against short-range missiles. So you had a big struggle, and that was good for a news reporter like myself, and there were a lot of good stories. It was a very complex issue technically, but over the long run, it was extremely important. The argument of the arms control community, as reflected in most of the mainstream media, was that missile defense was bad. The first argument was that it didn't work. Well, guess what? It does work, and they managed to get it to work. They would always highlight test failures. And of course, if you stop doing things when you have a test failure, you'll never fix the problem. So test failures are normal, but yet the test failures were used to highlight that this doesn't work. Then when it finally worked, then they said, well, it will upset relations with Russia, or the Soviet Union and then Russia. So that was one area. The other issue that I wanted to raise was the de-Islamicization of the war on terrorism. This is another politically correct thing which is extremely damaging in terms of really disarming our troops ideologically. They're waging war. When the Obama administration came in, they made a decision based on lobbying by a number of Muslim groups that don't call terrorists Muslim terrorists. And so instead we have now the term violent extremists, which actually doesn't really capture what's going on in the war on terrorism. The terrorists who are out there are violent jihadists who are waging jihad against the United States. It's a central tenet of their religious belief. Now, the debate over whether that is a legitimate tenet of Islam or not is still going on. But to say that this is that it's not an Islamic problem is really making it harder to win the war on terrorism, which ultimately will be won ideologically. If you ask anyone in the military if you can kill all of the terrorists, they'll be the first to tell you no, because they keep regenerating. It's going to take some kind of ideological counter, and yet again the government has redefined the struggle, and that has its impact is reflected again in the coverage. And then last I would mention China. We've, over the last decade, the U.S. has lost about 10 years in fully understanding the nature of the threat from China. It was explained away very early on. Again, the academic community and the policy community adopted this notion, what they call the self-fulfilling prophecy. If you treat China as a threat, it will become a threat. Therefore, they went to great lengths to delude the government and thus the press that China was not a threat. And in fact, it is a threat, and it has now emerged as such. And people are beginning to wonder, well, the first thing that happens, they stop saying that it's not a threat. Now the thing is, well, we don't understand what their intentions are. Well, we clearly understand what. Yeah, it doesn't take much, but I hear this at the highest levels of our government, and of course that's reflected in most of the mainstream media. I'll stop there and turn it over to Sara to give her remarks. Thank you very much.